New York City, a metropolis built on ambition, steel, and capital. But for nearly a century, another government operated quietly in the shadows. It wasn't elected, it was rarely visible, but it was absolutely feared. They were simply known as the Five Families. When we think of the American Mafia, our minds immediately go to Hollywood. We think of Marlon Brando or Al Pacino or maybe Robert De Niro, but behind this cinematic fiction was a staggering reality. For decades, five major Italian-American crime families held a monopoly over organized crime in New York City: the Genovese, the Gambino, the Lucchese, the Colombo, the Bonanno. Together, they formed the American branch of La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. But these weren't just street thugs or random gangs. They were highly structured, fiercely hierarchical, and brutally corporate. In every traditional mafia family, power flows from the top down through a strict hierarchy. At the top sits the boss, ultimate authority. Major decisions, disputes, and strategy all go through him. Beneath is the underboss, the second in command. He manages daily operations and steps in when the boss is unavailable. Advising them is the consigliere, a trusted counselor who offers guidance and mediation, often considered the third most powerful figure. Below the administration are the capos. Each capo leads a crew and oversees operations within a specific territory or business. Under the capos are soldiers, also known as made men. They are official members who carry out orders and have taken an oath of loyalty known as omerta. At the base are the associates. They work with the family but are not formally inducted members. This hierarchy keeps the organization structured, controlled, and disciplined. But you couldn't just apply for a job. To become a made man, you traditionally had to be of full Italian descent. You had to prove your worth, and finally you had to take the oath of omerta, the code of silence. A burning picture of a saint in your hand, a brick of blood from your trigger finger, a vow of loyalty for life. Breaking the oath didn't mean you got fired, it meant you disappeared. To understand how the five families took control, you have to go back to the early 1900s. Massive waves of Italian immigrants arrived in New York, facing widespread discrimination, poverty, and closed doors. In the crucible of the slums, neighborhood street gangs formed as a means of survival. Over time, those street gangs evolved into sophisticated criminal enterprises. But the real turning point arrived in 1931. A bloody power struggle known as the Castellamarese War had just ended, leaving two of the city's most powerful mafia leaders dead. Out of the chaos stepped a young, incredibly strategic gangster named Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano realized that constant war was bad for business, and instead of fighting to be singular boss of bosses, he modernized the underworld. He established the five families, giving each their own territory and rackets. To keep the peace, he created the Commission, a governing body of family bosses that settled disputes. He structured the mafia like a Fortune 500 board of directors, and terrifyingly enough, it worked. So how did they make their money? At the street level, it was the classics like extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and eventually narcotics. But their real power lay in how deeply they infiltrated legitimate society. The five families sank their claws into the very infrastructure of New York. They controlled the labor unions, the waterfront docks, the waste management contracts. They even controlled the concrete supply. For decades, it was almost impossible to build a skyscraper in Manhattan without paying a mob tax. At their peak between the 1950s and 1980s, they commanded thousands of associates. Hollywood glamorized the lifestyle, painting them as men of honor. But the reality was an empire built on extortion, intimidation, and murder. For over 40 years, law enforcement was essentially powerless against the upper management of the mafia. Soldiers went to prison, bosses stayed insulated. That all changed in 1970 with a piece of legislation called the RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO was a silver bullet. It allowed prosecutors to hold the bosses legally responsible for the crimes committed by their underlings, simply for being part of a corrupt enterprise. In the 1980s, the government launched the historic commission trial, successfully prosecuting the heads of New York's crime families simultaneously. Suddenly, the mafia was no longer untouchable. Between the devastating RICO charges, aggressive wiretaps, and a wave of informants breaking the sacred vow of omerta, the walls finally started closing in. Despite the onslaught, the families did not die out. They just earned their own distinct legacies. The Genovese, often called the Ivy League of organized crime, highly secretive, disciplined, and still considered the most powerful. The Gambino, the flashy powerhouse, they became globally infamous in the 80s under John Gotti, the Teflon Don, whose love for the spotlight eventually led to his downfall. The Lucchese, the quiet earners, deeply embedded in labor and construction rackets. The Colombo, youngest family, notorious for bloody internal civil wars that severely crippled their ranks. The Bonanno, the resilient outcasts, one kicked off the commission entirely due to internal scandals. They slowly fought their way back. So the ultimate question, are the five families still active today? Yes, but the game has changed. Today's mafia is a shadow of its former self. They are smaller, quieter, and highly allergic to media attention. The flashy violence of the 20th century has been replaced by subtle financial schemes, offshore gambling rings, and white-collar fraud. The mafia did not vanish, it simply adapted to the modern world. For nearly a century, the five families shaped the underworld of New York City. They inspired legends, defined pop culture, and built an empire of fear. The golden age of the American mafia is officially over, but the shadow they cast over the concrete jungle is one that New York will never fully outgrow.